I'm going to compact some stuff and then shorten the end. But I do need us to do this little focus on healthcare decision-making and our tradition. Because part of what I set out to do was to clarify some of what our teaching actually was, and misunderstandings about our teaching that really affect the way people then are free to make good choices in sickness and in dying. So there is, the second chapter is actually, after Gethsemane, the very next one continues from Gethsemane, because if you recall, what happened was that as he gets ready to go with the apostles to Jerusalem, Judas comes in and betrays him. And in the story, what is important to me is he's then bound. Jesus is then physically bound. But as they first come to capture and bind him, one of the apostles, in fact, the one that we just read, the most recent one we read, said it was Peter. Not all the Gospels say it's Peter. Somebody tries to defend Jesus from being arrested, and they cut off the ear of one of the assailants. And the amazing thing is, what does Jesus do? He says, "What are you doing?" So here he is coming, while they're binding him, in my moral imagination, the apostles strike out to protect him in violence, and he's saying, no, that's not the way we will respond. So the theme of this chapter is Jesus showing us that even when you are captured by illness, have you ever heard anybody describe that? Being literal, physically feeling, psychologically feeling captured by their illness. So I'm a breast cancer survivor. And my example is, I had the triple radical mastectomy, 4 months of chemotherapy, 3 months of radiation. I mean, that whole year, not only was it killing me to be the person being taken care of instead of the person doing the care, you couldn't plan a blessed thing because you had to wait for your blood results. You had to, was your white count low enough? Were they going to give you chemotherapy? Was that going to be right after the chemo? Was the chemo going to be so sick that you couldn't say, yeah, I'll come to the Jew. No, I'll go to that man. Your whole life, how many people you know, back and forth to the Montreal Jewish Children's Hospital, they can feel totally constrained by their illness. So this chapter is to show, even when Jesus is physically captured, he is still free to choose how he will respond to his situation. And so in that chapter, in reflecting on that, one of the things that I tried to do was to just capture, and I'll do these too fast, but you need to see them. Essential teaching of the church that I think is misunderstood and even misrepresented. First, this is from the Catechism, and if there is only one thing from the Catechism about healthcare decisions for Catholics, it would be this one. Life and physical health are precious gifts entrusted to us by God. We must take, what's the next? Reasonable. We must take reasonable care of them, taking into account the needs of others and the common good. Reasonable. Our moral tradition is prudential. It isn't black and white, dramatic. It's always taking into account circumstances. And I need you to hold, we'll come back to this again, but this is the teaching. Reasonable care of them. But we do have to take care of them. We have a duty. Part of the freedom, then, that we have in taking reasonable care is the freedom to choose. Now, in medical ethics teaching, people talk about informed consent. That's not the issue. The issue is informed choice. And the choice can either be consent to or refusal of. And you need to understand, because reasonable care is the standard to which we're held, we can refuse. And this is one great example. There's tons of examples of this at our church teaching. I like this one. So this is from St. John Paul in Evangelium Vitae. To forego extraordinary, sorry, there's a typo, extraordinary or disproportionate means is not the equivalent of suicide or euthanasia. It rather expresses acceptance of the human condition in the face of death. Surprise, surprise. In fact, there's a quote, I gotta find it there's a quote I saw a year and a half ago. It was Paul VI, when he was writing the original allocution about the anesthesiology. But Paul VI said something like, to in fact put the prolongation of biological life as the absolute value is an idolatry of the body. I've never been able to find it back. I'll Google it with the exact language, but every time I think of it, I forget to go find it. But so Jesus is showing us, no matter how constrained by circumstances, you are free to make the choices that map your values, your beliefs, and your understanding of the right and the good. Now these comments, reasonable and you can forego, I think are important because one of the conditions that sometimes makes things problematic for many Catholics is that we actually hear demands that Catholics have to do everything possible to prolong biologic life as a duty of standing for life in a culture of death. No. That's not so. I mean, some of the demands and some of the cases that you see to this Charlie Gard, if you saw this babies, people are nuts. And it is, in Paul VI's language, an idolatry of the physical body. So look at this one. This is the next one, 2289 in the Catechism. If morality requires respect for the life of the body, it does not make it an absolute value. Of course not. What's absolute value? The absolute value is union with God. It's union with God. So sometimes we've made it look as if there are binaries that are, and so some people think, well, I either have to do everything or I'll just give up and end it all. And people can refuse. They can make but their choice has to be on an informed conscience and based on careful reflection. Look at this one, because it's another important point I think has become, for those of you who do pastoral care or speak to people who think that you, in fact, can guide them in difficult decisions. This is a quote from the Holy Father Benedict. Human life, however, has intrinsic limits. Remember the guy who was refusing? You'll find the technology, some machine somewhere, some hospital somewhere, some research protocol somewhere will, in fact. Human life, however, has intrinsic limits, and sooner or later it ends in death. Surprise, surprise. Sooner or later it ends in death. This is an experience to which each human being is called, and one for which he or she must be prepared. That was a World Day of the Sick message. All right, so what I'm saying to you is, I think that we, in general in Canada, but specifically, explicitly in the faith community, have not done advanced care planning as we should. And it's now become an urgent issue. So let me be very clear. Many of you in this room, certainly the religious, I don't know, but my community requires that I have an advanced directive, meaning in the circumstance when I can no longer speak for myself, I have appointed, that happens because my family, my brothers don't practice the faith and they're far away from me. It's two sisters who happen to have my advanced directive. And many people legally will have that. You talk to lay audiences, they say that they've got somebody. The important thing is the appointment of someone to speak to you when you can no longer speak for yourself is the third step in advanced care planning. If you don't do the first two steps, then the third step is doomed to failure. Advanced care planning is a spiritual activity. Because the first thing, and first of all, everybody with the diagnosis of a serious illness at the onset of the illness should do this. And if in fact you have a condition that in fact is potentially lethal, you don't get through the next week without doing this. You've got to do this. The first part of advanced care planning is in fact a clarification of values and beliefs. How do you think of medical science? How do you think of technology? How do you think about the issue of dying? How do you think about where you are with regard to the last things that you want to accomplish in life? I'm saying that for the Catholic community in 2018, that throughout the church we need everyone to begin a reflection, not just because they're swept away by the new normal of medically assisted death, but a reflection on how can we think of all this stuff through the life, suffering, death of Jesus Christ, the suffering servant. How can we think of that? It's a way, I think, to do catechesis and evangelization. But it's the first step in all advanced care planning. The second, then, is communication. Biggest problem is that people may have in their own mind had kind of an idea of what they want, but they don't communicate it to all of their family members who might need to know it, or for those of us in religious life, to your religious superiors or those who need to know it, and to your healthcare team. So the appointment of someone to speak for you can be worthless if that person is clueless as to your values. Because the person doesn't decide for you when you can't the way they want. That's one reason I don't have either of my brothers. I love them dearly, but they don't practice the faith. They haven't their whole adult lives. They're clueless as to how I understand this in the light of faith. So I have to have someone who understands me and my faith, because the job for Sister Joan O'Keefe happens to be our congregational leader, but for years she's had my health proxy. Joan has to step inside and say, not this is what Joan would want, but this is what Nuala would want. It's only when you have a person who can speak for you in the circumstance that person gives you a great gift by attempting to speak for you when you can't. So I'm just giving you people have kind of thought advanced care planning and all of this kind of stuff. Somehow or other, some Catholics think that's a capitulation to something. And I think it's a spiritual activity that's essential. So that would be kind of where I would have left one. And part two is now about, I'm setting up the challenge, which I think is enormous, that medically assisted death raises for our tradition of a good death, and basically the fundamental mystery of our faith, which is the suffering, life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's not Christmas. Christmas, which, by the way, is not about babies and Santa, not even about babies. It's about the incarnation. The mystery is the incarnation. Human flesh is holy. That human flesh makes possible the suffering that, in fact, is suffering we can identify with. So for me, the issue now is the first part. I tried to clarify some of the magnitude and show how, when I use my stories in my book, I want you to use your stories. In fact, I have had the opportunity in a few dioceses to do pre-study days for sometimes in Victoria, I did it for 2.5 days. So we did the situation, and then we had the priests gather around and they did their own stories of either in their own personal lives or in their pastoral lives, what kind of patient situations they experienced. And how now you would rethink trying to bring the Lord's experience to someone who suffered. So now what I'm going to do very briefly is, because I want us to have at least a half an hour for back and forth, and if I've confused you, please tell me. But I want your insights and your thoughts on where things are with this. So let's just now move to this other phase of prophetic. So part one was really to understand the issue that is raised by medically assisted death and to have prophetic resistance against the medicalization of suffering. But if we're going to be prophetically resistant to the wrong, the unjust, the moral, the exploitative, then we have to show prophetic witness to the care and accompaniment, in Francis's language, of those conditions and those persons for whom those conditions would make them seek medically assisted death. We have to begin now to witness to the care and compassion for all of those things, feelings of loss of dignity, people being alone. I mean, how many times, I mean, even though general loss of participation in church matters, but constantly when I do conversation with lay audiences, you talk, Mary Flattery always sat third row, right-hand side in the pew, 10:30 Mass. All of a sudden, Mary's not there. Who in the parish community says, "Oh my God, did you notice Mary's not there? Where does Mary Flaherty, does anybody know where she lives? Will somebody go check on her?" We don't do that. We don't do that. Even, by the way, what little aside, liturgical thing. Father, please listen to this. Liturgical thing. When, in fact, we have people who bring the Eucharist from the Sunday celebration to the sick, drives me crazy that people come up in private with their little thing, to take their little host. And they should be called up at the end of communion and commissioned to bring this Eucharist from this community to those who, we don't do those things that make it in our bones as Catholics. What's the line? Where is it in Scripture? If one of us is sick, we all suffer. We are the body of Christ. So that if Mary Flaherty is not there, somebody should notice and do something about it. So let's talk a little bit about prophetic resistance now. And I'm going to go rapidly about confusions about palliative care, the importance of advocacy for hospice and palliative care, and then just to give you a proposal for a renewed ministry for all of the baptized that I think is part of the call of all Christians. And it's really the modern call to the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. So, it seemed natural to me in looking at Jesus' experience. I should tell you, this was a 10-month intensive experience. I speak rapidly, I think rapidly, I write. I'm like Jesus in Gethsemane, the blood's out. I go to the bathroom so often during 3 hours of writing that it's ridiculous. Not because I have to go, but because it seems like a legitimate reason to get up and avoid the words. I can say them, I can't see them on the paper. But it seemed logical to me in all of this that during the 4 months before I delivered the book, except for Christmas Day, I read one of the Passion narratives every single day for 4 months. Most intense spiritual experience of my life. And I can tell you that what was amazing to me is, having gone to church my whole life and prayed and read Scripture and studied it some, I was still amazed that I would read things in Scripture and you'd say, "Oh my, I never knew that was there." So 2 things happened with Simon of Cyrene. One is, he was naturally going to be the chapter on palliative care because everybody needs help at the end. Everybody needs it. Simon is the sign for me of palliative care. But you know what the aha moment was? Simon didn't volunteer. He was seconded. And presumably then he wasn't a Jew because they were worried that then he would be getting into the time for the Sabbath. So the important thing here is that in this chapter, we talk about the importance of palliative care, and I'm going to show you some misunderstandings. But we also, I think, have this interesting challenge because perhaps personally, but certainly for loved ones or persons that you've served pastorally, you would have seen people in institutions of care, maybe even including hospice palliative care, definitely long-term and residential care, where people are helping, but they're so grudging, so nasty, so uncaring in the way they respond. You really want to say, get the hell out of here and I'll do it myself. I'd rather suffer than be subjected to this. There is something very challenging for us in not just making sure that we respond, but making sure that our response is one that is a manifestation of the healing, reconciling mission of Jesus Christ. So, Simon, the chapter's about palliative care. The story is about a 56-year-old with ALS, terrible disease. Okay. What we say in this chapter, repeat again, that we, in fact, in our tradition, clearly reject euthanasia and assisted suicide. And as Father Benedict says, indeed, the true response cannot be to put someone to death, however kindly, but rather to witness to the love that helps people face their pain and agony in a human way. All right? So the interesting thing for me is that we have challenges today in response. And I'm going to make a suggestion that we actually have the societal response and provision of palliative care, but many people, especially in chaplaincy and pastoral care, but in visiting the sick, will also have the situation of having persons they're helping or visiting express an interest in medical aid in dying. And the question of how do we personally respond? So we have response at a number of levels. And I can tell you that the important thing here, and I paid attention to this pastorally, there are at least 5, including a revision of the Atlantic Episcopal Assembly's paper on this, Western bishops, Episcopal statements on this. But basically you need to understand this from doctors' experience and pastoral. When someone says to a doctor, can't you do something about this? Can't you just end it? Do something, doc. That has happened throughout human history. That is not a request or a firm commitment for medical aid in dying. That's a cri de coeur. That's a cry for help. And it always has been, historically. The problem is that now that it's become legal to respond to the cri de coeur, with now let's move into the eligibility for assessment and the procedure, we've shown, the state of Oregon has shown this, doctor's attention immediately turns to the medical eligibility rather than the traditional response of what a dear friend of mine who does palliative care says, when you hear that kind of talk from a patient, you sit down and lean in. That's the time when, so the issue then though moves, some people who express that in this day and age, now that it's legal, will in fact move to a requestment for eligibility assessment. That's the next step nationally. Are they eligible? Just hold this for me a minute. And then after they know that they're eligible for this, the next step is that they make a firm request. I am eligible for medical aid in dying, and I want medical aid in dying. And then the last step in the continuum is they have a medical aid in dying. Now, I just want you to think this way about this. Just as with all situations, there are either responses that are far more pastorally oriented or ones that are more orthodox oriented, meaning they're concerned about the the rightness or wrongness of the moral tradition in the circumstance. So you'll see that for some people, most people can recognize when somebody says, "Can't you do something about this?" That's a huge cry for increased pastoral and medical attention. Review the issues, make sure the spiritual issues. When a person makes a request, "Am I eligible?" Because remember, you have to meet the criteria for eligibility, right? For those who are more Orthodox inclined, it's actually a debate among the Episcopal conferences in the country, just so you know. Surprise, debate among the Episcopal conferences. You have some bishops who believe that the request for eligibility assessment is the first move towards the act of medical aid in dying, and that from that time on, you cannot continue to accompany the individual because you're now complicit with them doing something that is sinful. Understand that? Yeah. Now, just so you understand, that is a way of understanding. It's got a certain historical validity to it. If you have a more pastoral approach, you say, wait a minute, and this can fit with, there's a moral principle of cooperation. I won't confuse those of you who don't know what that is. The more pastoral approach says, no, the assessment for eligibility can still be understood as they're still getting more information about this. And morally, getting information, you still have not done anything immoral. So many people will say, stay with, accompany, right? Even while they get the eligibility assessment. Now, the hard part on the spectrum is they've gone through the eligibility assessment, they are eligible, and now they say, I am now formally requesting medical aid in dying. How do people of faith who believe that what they're doing is morally wrong, if they move to medical aid in dying, the act, how do you support them? What is the nature of the spiritual support? Because on the one hand, we don't want to abandon them. On the one hand, we want to be recognizing, as we'll see in a moment, that what Jesus teaches us on the cross is patients who are dying are not objects of care. They are actively working out their salvation till the very last breath. Think of the 7 last words of Jesus on the cross. Taking care of everybody else almost all the time. Thinking about them all, right? The good thief, his mom. So the issue for us becomes complex in how do you stand for the merciful God and the healing, reconciling Jesus, but when are you in fact potentially witnessing to what you believe is morally wrong? And of course that clearly comes about when the question is asked, can a chaplain, can a Catholic pastoral care worker be present when the medical death is performed? This is an unprecedented question in terms of our history. And I think it's one that we're still working on. I think there is a time when you have to say, I cannot now witness. It's like witnessing to a sin. But recognizing this, my own preference is to go as long as they know your position and you're trying to accompany them by witnessing, go as far as you can up to the act. But there are definitely Episcopal visions of this that move far more to once the actual situation is they want eligibility assessment, that now they're moving into anything that you're doing now to accompany them looks as if you are complicit with evil and supporting them. So a very serious issue that we all face. But what I want you to know is that as we come now to the end of this, and you guys get to talk a little bit, with palliative care, I was talking to Father, somebody wanted him to do a funeral, but they were instructing him not to say anything about the fact that the person had died during the funeral service. I have to tell you, may think that that's ludicrous. I have to tell you, life is so ludicrous right now on this that doesn't surprise me a bit. But how many times don't tell Mama she's dying. she'll lose hope. That's part of a chapter here. What in the name of all that's good flies in the face of human life has its limits and it's one we should be prepared? What if Mama has some unreconciled stuff that she has to do and you're giving her false hope? We're death denying and death defying. Remember, Nuala told you that. Okay. But many of my friends in medicine, not the palliative care folk, whom I love dearly, hospice and palliative care folk, doctors and nurses and social workers, talk about the P word. Don't you dare talk about palliative care with my sister. Don't you dare say that to my father. As if palliative care, palliative care is in fact, and we'll quote the Holy Father, first of all, its philosophy is it totally compatible with the notion of an environment for a good death. Neither hastens nor prolongs death. It balances pain and symptom control with those last spiritual things. It's balancing all the time. And it focuses on the dying person and their intimate others. So Holy Father Francis says, palliative care is an expression of the properly human attitude of taking care of one another, especially of those who suffer. It bears witness that the human person is always precious, even if marked by age and sickness, and is loved by God. For this reason, when life becomes very fragile and the end of earthly life existence approaches, we feel the responsibility to assist and accompany the person in the best way, which is the palliative care hospice environment. So, there are also a number of issues we don't have time to go into in detail about pain control. I'll address that in the subject. I do want to say, again, the chapters in my book on Jesus being crucified, that's the chapter on the process of dying, and then Jesus dying, two different chapters. And what they're emphasizing is in our day and age, dying is not a normal experience. For at least the last 200 years, people who die in institutions. The fact that Ars Moriendi and throughout human Grandma was dying in the back room of the farmhouse, or she was upstairs. So the important thing here is that the dying person, historically, remember the stories of good, excellent dying are important. If you are not there accompanying the dying, seeing it, you can't see that the dying person is teaching those who care for the person as much as the persons who care for the dying person are in fact witnessing. And there are different trajectories of dying. Just one fast, this is a topic in itself. Please understand this. So Nuala will really shorten this one for you. We have an obligation to give food and drink. And that's a deeply rooted social one. And we're a Eucharistic people, for heaven's sakes. It's got even more symbolism, right? Give a sip of cold water in my name. Giving food and drink is not providing medically assisted nutrition and hydration through IVs and tubes. That got all confused. A long-standing tradition, at least 300 years of tradition, got confused by an allocution of the Holy Father, St. John Paul. The important issue, I think, here is if someone's dying and they're a scotch drinker, I'll bring the flask of scotch in myself. We had one of our sisters, a darling friend of mine, she was from Cork, the only sister in our community who was born in Ireland. 93, amazing, I loved her. Went to visit her 3 days before she died. I'd been visiting her a couple times, but 3 days before she died. And I said, "Now, Laura, darling, what could I bring you?" And she said, Nuala, she said, I'd love a last taste of Guinness. She was in the rehab palliative care thing in Halifax, and we were going to try to get her home for the death, but she was in getting assessed for something. I left the hospital, I went to the liquor store. You could only get a 4-pack of the cans of Guinness in Halifax. So okay? I got the one, stuck it in my pocket, and put on my white coat. and my Dalhousie medical faculty, I went in, closed the door, poured about 6 sips into a cup. Laura drank them, and she couldn't drink anymore, but it made no difference. If that's what she wanted, that's what she was going to get. That's what she was going to. She wanted Irish soda bread. I'd make the Irish soda bread myself and bring it in. But the issue of people being worried that their loved ones who are dying are starving to death, very, very serious issue. One of the issues we've got to be really clear about, and need to rethink that in an appropriate way. So, now I'm ending. Won't do that one. So I'm suggesting that the prophetic witness, specifically we have to advocate for hospice palliative care as a contrary philosophy to medical aid in dying. I'm also saying that as we're dealing with individuals who may be thinking about or requesting or making a decision that they want to go forward with medical aid in dying, we have very huge, delicate challenges of witnessing to the compassion of Jesus Christ, but not witnessing to sin and evil. And this is anybody who thinks that's easy hasn't done it. But I want to say that my last comment is chapter 10 is about Jesus' resurrection, but it has no patient stories. My claim in this chapter is that this chapter is about our stories. This is how we'll write the stories of what will we do now in prophetic resistance to the medicalization of suffering, prophetic witness to mercy and care, and protection of the vulnerable and protection of conscience. And I'm going to end with this. Father referred to this quote. Because we've professionalized all aspect of care, and our community, the social community has deteriorated for us, especially in urban centers. Parish communities, in fact, have become, in and out, get your Eucharist and go home, not the Eucharist and care. The celebration, the Eucharistic celebration and sacramental celebration and care are both happening in all communities, or neither should happen in all communities. So we need to reclaim new ways now, particularly attending to those issues of suffering and isolation. All the baptized are called to that. Some of the baptized are actually called to ministries of care, lay ministries of care and companionship, supporting the clergy. And I think some parishes, certainly throughout Canada and in my own diocese, we have an archdiocesan committee of care and companionship. I told you I chair that for my bishop. And we're just beginning to think we've got a website, people want to look at that, many ways in which we can provide resources for all kinds of situations. So, we're doing this with the understanding, and this is from Evangelium Gaudium, an evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in its people's lives. It bridges distances. It is willing to abase itself if necessary. Does that sound like Pope Francis or what? And it embraces human life, touching the suffering flesh of others. If there's any time when we have to touch the suffering flesh of others, it's when someone might be considering medically assisted death. And we're revising now our website, but anyone wants to go on the Archdiocese of Halifax Yarmouth website, go to the Archdiocesan Committee of Care and Companionship, and I said we're revising it. Each of these segments in our circle about our baptismal call is an area where we're trying to provide resources, link with programs, link with prayer resources. For example, we have access to the Catholic Health Association of the U.S. huge prayer library for caregivers, for persons whose mother is dying, for persons who are caring for an Alzheimer's, all kinds of support. Starting with hospital care, chronic illness, mental illness, aging and elder care, each of these areas, including the spirituality of caregiving, which we increasingly have realized is something we have been lacking in. The spirituality of caregiving and the needs of those who care for others. Because we have, remember, guilt at being a burden to others is one of the big reasons. So we're looking at all of these for ways that we can, if we're going to prophetically resist, then we prophetically witness. And as young people would say, we walk the talk. Thanks.